So I gotta try.
Sorry.
Like it's like a challenge. Can I get sneak into the top
No,
five?
well, Jehangir, I guarantee you this will be a top 10 podcast because
Dr. Jehangir Appoo is a world-renowned medical leader focused on innovation to drive healthcare improvement. After completing his cardiac surgery residency at the University of Alberta in 2003, Dr. Appoo completed 2 fellowships. The first in advanced cardiovascular surgery from the Royal Brompton Hospital Imperial College in London, and the second in thoracic aortic surgery, endovascular aortic surgery, and heart failure surgery from the University of Pennsylvania in 2005. Following his fellowship in 2005, Dr. Appoo became a clinical associate professor of cardiac surgery at the University of Alberta, where he founded the Artificial Heart Program, which resulted in Southern Alberta's first artificial heart device implant. From 2005 to 2019, Dr. Appoo was an active cardiac surgeon and founding director for numerous programs such as the Calgary Thoracic Aortic Program, which he served as the director from 2007 to 2019. At which point, Dr. Appoo left the cardiac surgery world to first mentor at Creative Destruction Lab, a nonprofit organization that delivers an objectives-based program for massively scalable seed stage science and technology-based companies. And second, to launch AIoT Health, a health tech investment fund focused on the application of technologies of tomorrow, in particular, artificial intelligence, AI, and the Internet of Things, IoT, to reimagine healthcare. Jehangir, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alan. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on.
so Jehangir, go ahead, Alan.
Go for it, Josh. I was going to make a joke about Calgary, but that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead. Make your joke.
Well, I was just going to say, did you notice the pronunciation of Calgary versus Calgary? Calgary, Calgary. I don't know if that's a common thread.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Subtleties in sort of Eastern and Western Canada, so it still continues.
So Jehangir, thank you so much for joining us. I think one of the reasons why Alan and I are excited to have you, number one, you are officially our first external guest. So thank you for taking a chance on this podcast. And number two
Thanks
is
for having me.
Absolutely. And number two is you have a very, very interesting story. We know that physicians are very, very innovative, and physicians are doing all kinds of innovative things. They're, maybe like building medical devices or are doing really unique research. But you actually became a venture investor, which I think is very unique and not a very common path for physicians. So that got me and Alan particularly excited about bringing you on. So I think our listeners will be, particularly our physician listeners, will be very interested in hearing how you did that. But maybe to kick things off, you and I actually met through a mutual contact through Ray Muzyka. For those who don't know, he's an ER doctor turned video game entrepreneur, turned mentor and investor, and he's actually an investor at SeamlessMD. But how do you know Ray? And maybe we'll start there.
Yeah. So Ray's a friend. He's a very experienced angel investor, and he's been a bit of a mentor to me. And he, I think, connected us because he told me he was looking at a few companies that were interested and asked me if I was interested in an introduction to any of them. So he gave me a list of 6 or 8 of them. And like, as you know, Josh, you've been a big advocate of like this double opt-in. So he asked you if you'd be interested in introduction, asked me if I was interested in introduction, then wrote a third email introducing us. and so that's how I think we got connected, thanks to Ray. Yeah, so.
Awesome. And Jehangir, can I give you a funny story about double opt-in? So
Okay.
I used to write a lot. I have a personal blog, and I haven't written probably in 2 years now. I miss writing. But I actually wrote a blog post about the double opt-in after I learned about it. And I said it was great, it was important, and I started doing it. And then one day I did not follow the double opt-in advice, and I connected 2 people on it. And I got called out on it because that person knew that I'd written a blog post about the double opt-in.
Good for them. Good for them.
Yeah. Good.
I mean, that's kind of like, that shows some of the value of writing. It actually makes you commit to things and makes you accountable for things. And then you can look back and sort of revise it and know where you were at one point in time and see where you are today. But I think there's real value. And I think, I learned that a little bit from you as well. Like that double opt-in, it's a little bit more work, but it's useful, and you always want to make introductions that have some I always try to make sure there's some reason behind the introduction, not just you should meet someone or read or tell someone to read this. I try to like summarize why it might be interesting to them.
Actually,
Just because there's so much information,
yeah.
there's so much information in the world today that like you need some signal, right? Everyone's like, this is great, that's great, this is important. But you need some signal as to why.
Right.
Jehangir, I'm just curious, things like this, like how to give a good introduction or double opt-in or whatnot, are these things that you were learning when you were in medicine, or did some of this stuff happen because you moved into venture investing and then there's kind of this new skill set or communication style you had to get into instead?
Yeah, interesting. I haven't thought of that. I guess it's probably like most things in life, like I'll let progress in spots, but it's an evolution. So nothing just sort of starts out of the blue. There's always seeds, and there's always building up, and it's layer upon layer upon layer. Yeah. So it's about, I think, understanding what your sensibilities are and what resonates with you, and then you kind of follow more of these things, because these things are all out there. It's just a question of who wants to take it on, who does it make sense to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
makes sense.
I also imagine like skills that you've learned in one area are transitioning over to other areas, and it kind of builds concurrently depending on what you're doing. Kind of on that note, where I wanted to start, at least in terms of some of these questions, was knowing your story before your health tech investor side. So obviously, I imagine some of your investment work has been shaped by being a cardiac surgeon, and even before that, some of your experiences in the past. What was it that made you decide to become a cardiac surgeon in the first place?
Yeah, so I think I would say a two-part answer to that. Like, first is a didactic answer around like what I liked about heart surgery, and then the second is like the reality of how things happen, right, and the truth. So what did I like about heart surgery? I think for me it was around impact. That's kind of an important word in my life, and felt like we had a real impact on patients. I enjoyed the fact that patients were happy and satisfied after heart surgery. You have people who can't breathe, get into the bathroom, and immediately after feel so well. And so much of other medicine was not as gratifying. And then I like the technical aspect of heart surgery. It was challenging and demanding, but satisfying. It was kind of like creating some art. And as a 25-year-old, I kind of liked challenging and hard things to do. And I think I still do to some extent. And I think the other thing with heart surgery for me was that there was a lot of interactions with different disciplines. So there's close interactions with the brain and with the lungs and with the kidneys. So as a young person starting in medicine, that really sort of resonated with me. So those are the reasons I like heart surgery. Not necessarily the reason I went into heart surgery. Is what happened is there was a time in my life where I enjoyed all different types of things in medicine. I was in med school. I really liked a whole bunch of things in internal medicine. I like general surgery, all these things. I just finished a cardiac surgery rotation. I enjoyed that. So that was added to my list of things I liked. And strange thing is I went on holiday with my brother to India, and we were visiting the Taj Mahal. We'd never been. And not far from the Taj was something called the Baby Taj. It's another monument. And India is so packed with people. And for some reason at this Baby Taj, there was nobody there, but this one couple. And it turned out to be the dean of my medical school from McGill University in Montreal.
That's
and
cool.
It was this usual doctor student superficial relations, questionnaire. Oh, hi, how are you doing? What are you interested in doing? That's kind of usually what you ask a medical student.
Yeah.
I like this, all these things. I just finished this rotation in heart surgery. I really enjoyed it. And he said, well, son, once you've seen the light, don't turn your back on it. And I remember I was just taking off from Delhi in the plane the next day, and I said, hey, okay, that's what I'm going to do.
Wow.
So, yeah. So there were a bunch of things I liked at that time, and I was kind of like in a decision-making algorithm process, and I had that interaction, and then I decided to follow it. And then since then, there's been lots I like about heart surgery.
Yeah. Do you believe in fate in some way? I mean, it's pretty fortuitous.
So that's kind of interesting. Yeah. So I believe in, like, for me, one of the most interesting definitions in the English language is around the definition of luck. which is when opportunity meets preparedness. So opportunity exists around all of us, probably, I'm talking about good luck, every day. Some people can't recognize it. Other people can recognize the opportunity. And then there's another group of people who can recognize the opportunity but say, maybe another day, another time, not now. And then there's another group who can actually recognize the opportunity and act on it. So I think we all know people who are quote unquote lucky. I don't really think it's a fate or designed thing. It's actually a skill set.
Right.
There's a reason those people are lucky.
Yeah, I mean, some people use the phrase creating your own luck. I think that's probably very similar to what you just mentioned. And I actually agree with you. You have to put yourself in opportunities to get lucky almost.
Yeah. So it's about recognizing the opportunity and then choosing to act on it. So I kind of like that definition. So maybe it sort of answers your question on faith.
No, it totally does. I think obviously you were in the right place at the right time as well, and that's the luck component, and then being able to recognize that.
Yeah.
So Jehangir, you were practicing cardiac surgeon for, I think, was it 15-ish plus years?
Yeah.
And then I think something happened where you had to explore something new. Are you able to share kind of
Yeah, sure. So like cardiac surgery is really fulfilling, doing lots of cool, exciting things. I was battling a problem with my neck for quite a few years, and the surgery and heart surgery itself just was the problem with I had a herniated disc in my neck. And so that bending of the neck just became a problem with what I do. And so after a few years of going through a variety of different sort of options, it became clear that the right thing for my own health long term was to not be in that position where I'm always putting that stress on my neck. And that's allowed me to be a lot healthier now. Yeah.
So what would you say is the most difficult part about leaving surgery and venturing off into something that's completely unknown?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One's the past, the other's the future. So in the past, it's like, your relationships that you have with patients, the gratification. The other thing is we have a really interesting relationship with the operating team. Like we're in really close quarters for a prolonged period of time. We're all elbow to elbow and lots of conversations occur there. It becomes like a second family. And so that's something that's difficult to leave, and the technical satisfaction of what we do. I think like the other part is what happens when you step away is, as physicians, it's a huge sense of our identity. Like regardless whether we want to believe it or not, whether we're polymaths or not, we have other interests, etc. Physicians are used to being Dr. So-and-so and being thought of that way. So that change in identity, I think, is a challenge. And I think that's a real challenge for even many retiring physicians. The second part is when you leave and try to look at what to do next, is that for the first time, you kind of have zero framework. There's no lattice work. Like you decided you're going to get into med school after first year, the second year med school. And after med school, you got to make some decisions, but there's something called residency that shows up. And after that, there may be a fellowship, and then you get a job. And there's certain like rough steps, things that you could put your foot on, and you can navigate up the mountain in different ways, but there's some place markers. And then when you leave that, suddenly there's like everything is a possibility. Right? Like everything's a possibility, right? Like my friends, you should go do ICU, that'd be great for you, or do palliative care, or you'd be great in government. Why don't you run for politics? Oh, you'd be really good at law. Why don't you do law and medicine, or do this and the other? So there's no framework. Yeah.
What was your process? So like you decided that, hey, for my health, I'm gonna stop, doing surgery, and then like you mentioned, there's all these options to consider for yourself. Did you have a process? Like what were the first few months like for you? Did you just go off and do nothing,
I'm not very good at doing nothing. I'm just not good at that. It's like a struggle. So I think it was probably a mental whirlwind, right? That trying to figure out next steps and looking at multiple possibilities, both in clinical and non-clinical work. I continued with my research work that I'm doing, and I'm still associated with the University of Calgary, research professorship. And
did
so
you
that was
actually try palliative care ICU work, or was that even something you?
I mean, I sort of thought about those things, and those things would be, I'm not operating, so they could potentially they would be feasible. And I looked at what I had done and what I wanted to do, and again, it comes down to impact. And I thought that this was a chance to do something, a little bit different here, and build on some other skill sets. And I like taking sort of concepts from different disciplines and merging them together. And so I sort of did a wide view, and sort of one thing led to another, and I've landed sort of firmly at the intersection of finance and medicine, and it's another new area.
So, I mean, two things that you're heavily involved in, there's Creative Destruction Lab, and then there's your investment fund in health tech, AIoT Health. Which one came first for you?
So I started with CDL, the Creative Destructive Lab, and I was doing my own investments, and then one thing led to another, and I sort of set up the fund. Yeah.
Gotcha. And just curious, I mean, Creative Destruction Lab, for those who don't know, I mean, is, in my opinion, probably the best network of entrepreneurs, investors, operators in the country, to be honest, in Canada. Now it's very much a global phenomenon. And so I was curious. I mean, it's not, I don't think they just pick anyone to be a CDL, mentor, associate, or whatnot. How did that happen for you? Like, who kind of brought you in there? Like, were you recruited?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
I think it's interesting, like, again, like how you get into, go to med school, get into cardiac surgery. It's about connecting the dots. And, Steve Jobs said this famously in his valedictorian lecture at Stanford. It's like, you can't connect the dots looking forward, but you can looking backwards. And so with CDL, a friend said I should meet Chen Fong, who's one of the founding members of CDL. I had no idea why I was meeting with Chen Fong and having coffee with him. I was like, okay, one more person. I think I did a lot of that when we were talking about when I was trying to explore what to do. It's like I had a lot of coffees. And so Chen invited me to attend one day and see what it's like, and sort of was very kind. And one thing led to another, and we ended up starting a fund. Chen's come on as an advisor to our fund. 3 of our first 4 companies have been CDL companies. So yeah.
It sounded like that was a pretty quick process to go ahead and start your fund. Was it really that quick, or did you, like, how much time did you spend deciding
super
that?
quick? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't part of the plan. It just sort of happened organically. I was doing this. People had asked, if they could participate with me, and then it came together really quickly. Like, I can't really even remember when that happened, that decision to start up a fund. But once it got started, it's just sort of compounded fast. Yeah.
And so, Jang, just so I understand, our listeners understand. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is it that, so you start mentoring for Creative Destruction Lab, you start talking to all these, startups, entrepreneurs, probably you're kind of more of the healthcare experts, you're talking to more healthcare companies. And is it that you started investing in some of these startups, and then other people around you said, hey, Jehangir, how do I get in on that? And then that's what made you go, oh, you know what? Maybe I should start a fund so I can help others participate. Is that sort of what happened, or?
Yeah, I think 2 parts of that. So one is, historically, I've had people ask me for financial advice, mentorship, who've asked to sort of be part of things that I'm getting into. So that was always there in the background. Secondly is, the reasons to set up the fund was all about alignment of incentives. And so I think I'm big on that, and it had to kind of work for 4 parties. And that was, it just sort of came together that way. So for the investors, they get to leverage my thought process, integrity, connections with medicine, understanding of finance, business. For myself and the team, what really it's about is being able to have a larger size check so that we can learn, so we can be more involved with the company. The more involved we are with the companies, the more we learn, the more we compound knowledge, which is one of my themes. And the more we learn, the more we can help other companies in our portfolio or future companies. So that's really the win for us. We don't charge management fees or anything So our investors get that. The win for the companies is that you get a bunch of people coming together as one name on the cap table, which, as you know, is a lot cleaner for the company and decreases the regulatory requirements and the amount required to close deals, expenses. And the fourth win is really around the science of medicine. So we're only interested in investing in things that are going to have an impact in a meaningful impact in the future of healthcare. So when those four things align, that's what we, get involved with. And so that's what the fund did, was allowed those incentives to align.
Gotcha. And just since you graciously gave your time to Ellen and myself, we want to make sure you can promote yourself and your fund. So, because there could be an entrepreneurs listening on the call. So from an AIoT Health point of view, obviously it's healthcare technology and AI focused, but is there a certain sweet spot for you in terms of either the types of companies, stage of companies, et cetera, that you're looking to meet with?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So, AIoT Health is our fund, and we're really focused on this evolution of machine learning in healthcare. I would say that the reason to set this up and to choose IoT tech and choose machine learning is that I feel like we're at a second opportunity here with major technologies. So when I started university, there was something called email. And nobody at that time could tell you how we'd be using the internet 30 years from then. People made all kinds of predictions, but nobody really knew that we'd be having this Zoom call today and how it would work and all the different parts that had to go into this. But we wouldn't consider living today without the internet. And so with machine learning, I feel this is the same way. I don't think you can sit here and actually say how we're going to be using machine learning in our lives 30 years from now, except that it's an impactful technology that we're all going to be using. So what we want to be involved with is the development of that technology and be part of that pathway going forward as machine learning is applied in healthcare to help improve healthcare outcomes and help improve precision healthcare. So the companies that we're focused on right now are companies using machine learning in a meaningful way to change outcomes in healthcare and in IoT tech, because so much of our world today is digital. The way we access finance, banking, movies, etc. Healthcare is not. Healthcare has been slow to adopt that, and there's a real opportunity. And this IoT tech has has potential with virtual care, getting care at home, and develops a lot of data as well.
Yeah. So Jehangir, on that note, obviously with COVID-19, virtual care is really becoming a priority for a lot of providers and healthcare organizations. And, we noticed that on Twitter, and by the way, for those who want to know your handle, it's at Jehangir Appoo. So give him a follow. But you had this really great framework that you shared on Twitter about how you think about virtual care. And so I'll just read it out here real quickly. So, you mentioned that there's kind of 4 components of virtual care in your perspective. One was online interface with, good security and user experience. 2 was remote patient monitoring and sensors. 3rd was, machine learning and analytics of data. And then lastly was patient engagement and patient reported outcomes. So curious to know, if there's anything you'd want to dive deeper on those topics, particularly in the context of COVID-19 now. We'll get your take on it.
Yeah, so virtual care is super exciting. And, Toby from CEO of Shopify said something where he said that COVID for certain industries has brought 2030 a decade early. And I think that applies perfectly to virtual care. Virtual care was in its infancy, had a little bit of momentum, but across North America, less than 1% of any patient-physician interaction was virtual. And with COVID, what it's done is it's forced physicians to participate in virtual care. Now, what physicians have learned is that A, patients love it, B, that physicians can actually do an efficient job, and it's quite good use of their time. And so virtual care going forward in a post-COVID world is going to exist. And it's going to be great for patients and their families. right? If mom needs an appointment, you don't need to take a half day off to go with mom to the doctor's office, this, that, the other. You can be involved in healthcare. So this is a space that tremendous momentum has come into. And so now the question is, what are the components of virtual care? And the first component is having a visual interface where you can have a HIPAA compliant private conversation. So that's, we've got the technology to do that. But then it becomes this issue about how does a physician do a physical exam? And so that's been the thing. So that's a really interesting space, and that IoT tech comes in because that's going to be the new physical exam going forward. And if we think about what we do as a physical exam today, there is huge variability in skill set. There are some, expert clinicians, but it can't be scaled. And it's so rudimentary in today's day of technology to be percussing and palpating and hearing a soft murmur and making a decision based on that. We're always getting another test. And, one physician do an exam one way, another one does it differently. So with this IoT technology, we're going to be able to do physical exams remotely, and we're going to be able to do it in a way that is data-driven. And these devices will produce a lot of data where machine learning algorithms can be applied. So that's the third component. And so once you get these wearable devices generating so much data, it's like, how do you use that data well, right? So much of the data does not impact care or change decision-making, how someone treats heart failure or the risk of a stroke. So how do you actually use that data to make meaningful decisions? And then the fourth component is, what you're involved with, which I think is interesting, is digital patient engagement and patient reporting outcomes, because that's a neat space in that I like that space because one, it's now being recognized by physicians and by payers. And physicians have always known that adherence to therapy can improve outcomes. So one of the cool things we can do in innovation is we can look at cool technologies like nano-technology or 3D printing and come up with awesome ideas to make changes. But patient engagement basically says, let's get people doing what we already know works, right? Like people aren't actually doing those things, and there's a reason, because they don't, again, alignment of incentives, right? There's a reason. So, we tell patients don't smoke and that's it, or give them a piece of paper, and, it doesn't necessarily translate. So I love the idea of, patient engagement, because it can take things that we already know and just make it better, right? Remove friction. So this is the other thing, like good businesses take things that are already possible and make it 10 times easier, right? So I think COVID has done that for virtual care, because initially the friction was from physicians who said, we can never do this. It's just so much easier for me to schedule my clinics and schedule an appointment and all this stuff. Now that friction's been removed. And with, patient engagement tools, it's a great way to get adherence to therapy and improve outcomes without having to, go to Mars and invent something else.
Jan, can I ask you, on the topic of virtual care adoption, so COVID-19, of course, accelerated that significantly, because for many providers and patients, you had no choice. If you wanted to talk to your provider, you had to go virtual in this world. Now, presumably, as things start to reopen and, maybe if there's a successful vaccine, or just generally there can be more in-person encounters between physicians and patients. What's your take on, how much will stay virtual once we are able to do more things in person again?
So I think, again, like the friction has been removed from doing this. So patients are used to it now, and physicians are getting used to it. And so the whole space, I think, will explode. And I think with different subspecialties in medicine, there'll be different amounts of virtual care. Some will be a lot more, some will be less. There will be a hybrid. So, for example, in cardiac surgery, maybe your first pre-op inpatient, first pre-op surgery visit could be an inpatient visit, but then your post-op visits and follow-ups might be virtual. And that might exist for a lot of different specialties, where the first time you sort of you build a relationship in person, and then, we're going to see you every year or every 6 months, and some of those things can be done virtually, especially if you can have that data being collected on those patients in the interim time, like managing someone's sugars, etc. So, and I think the other, you look at a country like Canada where specialist care is concentrated, and the advantage of that is that you deliver better care when you see more patients and have more expertise. But that means that we have a huge landmass. People are traveling many hours to go to a specialist hospital. So they'll travel from rural parts to the main city, or even if you live in the city, traveling to downtown Toronto is it's a big deal for everybody, right? And so patients will like it. I can imagine, like, again, for families, families can be a lot more involved in the healthcare of the elderly because they can easily, Josh, you can take half an hour out of your day and join in on a Zoom appointment when mom or dad has a clinic visit that you want to be there for, right? And and physicians realize this too. Physicians actually like it when patients are happy, right? And physicians are seeing how happy patients are. So virtual care is not going away. It's here. There's, reimbursement codes have been instituted by governments to facilitate it. I think they'll stay. What's going to be interesting is, like with anything new, you have different problems to overcome. And so with all these new technologies, you get this concentration of power. So if somebody becomes a real expert in thyroid disease, then everybody wants to see this person. And then what happens to your local doctor, right? And so this person with thyroid expertise does a really slick virtual setup, has a way patients can engage, this and that, sees so many patients, learns so much more about thyroid, his expertise or his or her expertise gets better. And now, every person sitting in Ontario wants to see this thyroid expert in Quebec or BC. And how do you bill for that? How do provincial governments handle that? What if the doc is sitting in Singapore, right? And you've got like billing issues and things. So there'll be, and is there do you need a referral? And is there a limited number of cases? And so there'll be new questions to answer and difficult things to take on. But that's kind of the history of all our lives forever, is that every time there's a new solution, then we have new problems come up with it, and we focus on solutions for those problems.
I think you bring up some really interesting topics. I mean, one is the idea you had about the fact that for a caregiver, being able to join in on a meeting with your loved one and the physician so much more easily. I hadn't even thought about that, but that's actually true now, which is incredible. But the other thing that came to mind was, well, that also means you can have group consults, right? Instead of having a consult with one specialist and then go to the other one, if you need both in the same room with the patient, you can do it more easily. And then the one thing you mentioned that was really interesting at the end was, in fact, the fact that you're almost democratizing access to the best talent in let's say, healthcare medicine. And in my opinion, well, if that forces everyone else to raise the bar of quality of the care they're delivering, maybe that's a good thing. And actually, it reminds me, I think it was Kaiser Permanente, who's been one of the most progressive health systems with virtual care. And I think part of their goal has been to use virtual care to actually grab more and more market share in the US across many more states. Their view is that if I can do a virtual visit from California to New York and I can get that patient in New York, I'm growing my business. And I can see that working in the US. I'm curious in Canada how that will be enabled, because right now everything's based on local catchment, right? Most hospitals and providers aren't really serving patients, like you said, across other cities or provinces or territories. And I don't think our payment model necessarily facilitates that in Canada. But I think the US is going to get very competitive as more and more systems want to use virtual care to kind of grab more market share. That's going to be a very, very competitive field.
So this is something that Ajar Agarwal, who's the founder of CDL, the professor of economics at Rotman, taught me, is that this concentration of power. When you get these exponential technologies, there's only room for a couple people at the top, right? Like when you do a search, how many people go outside of Google to search? Who's using the fifth best? What happened to Ask Jeeves and all those other search engines, right? And so it's this concept of democratization, which is very interesting. And so with virtual care, same thing. Now in Canada, we are allowed to bill for interprovincial visits. There is, issue, like the government has that set up, but they're not set up to deal with large amounts, right? It's for occasional things. And so it also brings up this question going forward, like if you have an AI, so what does machine learning do? Machine learning makes predictions. What do physicians do? They make diagnoses. And this is another example from Ajar Agarwal. So now you have machine learning that can make predictions, which are diagnoses. Now there's not a lot of room for the 15th best algorithm. Everybody wants to talk to, right? So it brings up all these solutions, bring up future questions. But just because they bring up questions doesn't mean that they're not beneficial for society and that we shouldn't work on them and find solutions to them.
You know what's funny? So when I think about machine learning versus humans in medicine, so take a human physician, right? We're fallible. Humans make mistakes, and if Jehangir, as a physician, you made a mistake diagnosing a patient issue, people would accept that, right? I think there's a problem with it, right? You had a hospital that in their radiology department implemented this machine learning model to, read certain images and make certain diagnoses. And if, let's say, that model had, a 1% or 0.1% error rate and made a mistake and it got found, I feel as if people would be concerned, people up in arms, but we don't realize that humans make mistakes and we have an error rate too. But we would get very mad at an algorithm for making a mistake.
Totally agree. I think
trying to learn faster.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think you're just bang on there. Is about perception, right? Understanding, and I think there's a difference between understanding what's on an individual basis versus a population basis. So on a population basis, if a radiologist makes an error 5% of the time or 7% of the time, that may be acceptable to the population. Say that, human error, this missed that, there's another test, we'll get this done. But if an algorithm makes an error 1% of the time, that may not be acceptable. But overall, if you're treating millions of people, what would you rather have? Right? Like from a larger population basis, you would rather have the person or the technology that makes an error 1% of the time with potential to further improvement. But there is a human-human connection. So that's going to be one of the things that one of these issues that we'll have to work out going forward with machine learning. And the other point.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, one of the reasons it's been well shown is that of poor healthcare outcomes is inter-physician variability. So whether it's a group of physicians in a city, a bunch of GI docs working at the same hospital, and they treat patients differently, or whether it's in a province or across a country, when we all see patients, we feel like we're the seat of knowledge and they're coming to see us and we've got an opinion on how to treat that patient. But so many physicians in the same subspecialties have different opinions and they just look at the data differently. And so it's been shown that inter-physician variability actually leads to poor outcomes, right? So it's maybe an important topic where we still want to have some autonomy as physicians, ability to think individually, etc. But at the same time, when every single physician thinks that they know best, and all of them are saying different things, that's not a scalable solution for a healthcare of 30 million people or 7 billion people.
Absolutely. I also wanted to ask you, you're on topic of machine learning. So, I mean, when we think about which specialties might be the most effective soonest, obviously radiology comes up a lot. And, one of the things that we think about is there's tension, obviously, between specialties and new innovations, especially when innovations could potentially threaten the livelihood of a specialty. And so when you think about, if you're like a radiologist or whatnot, like how would you advise a radiologist to think about the impact, for example, of machine learning on the business of radiology going forward? I mean, because I can imagine some people would intentionally push back because they're afraid their life would be affected, as opposed to embracing the fact that change is inevitable. There's so many industries that have been disrupted by technology, and better for worse, you have to let progress happen, and that affects certain jobs, frankly. I mean, you look back in history, I mean, before we had washing machines, humans had to wash their own clothes, and then all the human washers lost their jobs. And then obviously we're seeing more recently with things like, Uber and Lyft. And so someone argued that's just normal human progress with technology, that some jobs get lost. But I'd love to know how you'd advise radiology or other disciplines that are probably most affected by machine learning in the short term.
I'd probably start off by saying I wouldn't advise. because most people don't want the advice. Most people, again, it all boils down to alignment of incentives, right? People are incentivized by what they do. They want to protect their fiefdom, right? And they want to make sure that their families are taken care of. They've got issues, they've got things they need to deliver, right? So it's about the incentive. So if the people asking for advice want to protect that, they're not really thinking about, being open and wanting advice. So I wouldn't force advice. I think your idea of precedence makes a lot of sense. So it's about how people view things. Like, I think people probably throughout history have kept saying, oh, the world nowadays, people nowadays, the things that the young are doing nowadays, right? Like, they've been saying that probably in like 1500, they were probably saying the same thing, right? And we seem to have kept advancing as a society. And if you think about precedents, even within medicine, when drugs first became available for a disease like tuberculosis, thoracic surgeons felt threatened because there was nothing for them to do. Thoracic surgeons who operate on the lungs would generally operate on tuberculosis. And now you could treat it with a medication. So what are these surgeons going to go saying? Instead, they found other things to operate on, cancers in the lung, esophagus. They started getting into the heart and then doing cardiothoracic and so much other stuff. And no thoracic surgeon wants to operate on tuberculosis today, right? But there's always evolution. So it's about trying to figure out where you want to, how you want to adopt the technology, the trends that are coming, and where you can have an impact. I really, a piece of advice, like Eric Topol wrote a great book on this last year called Deep Medicine. And he talks about how machine learning in healthcare will actually augment the empathy in the patient-physician relationship. So what Eric Topol says is that radiologists may be more involved in explaining the results of the scan and showing the scan to patients, because an image is so powerful. Like, we've learned this with all social media and everything, right? So we don't really radiologists never discuss the CT finding with the patient. It's just a report, right? So maybe the radiologist will actually discuss, the findings with the patient, but also be more involved in what happens next. Should you go see a nephrologist for this kidney stone, or should you see a urologist, or, we could refer here, there, or the other. So there'll be different paradigms coming out. Again, it's probably like the internet 30 years ago. People couldn't predict like how we're going to be using it, but we're going to be using it. Figure out how you can use it well. Yeah.
It's funny. So I one of my best friends is a radiologist, and when we talk about the impact of AI on radiology, I always tell him, you know what, I think it's kind of inevitable. You should go work on AI and radiology so that you can actually help design the solution instead of just, waiting for the world to change in a way that you might not want or not be part of it in any way.
What does he say, or she?
Oh, he's interested, but then I think he's so busy doing clinical most of the time.
Yeah.
Jared, can I ask you? I want to ask you about chatbots actually, because chatbots are obviously a platform for leveraging AI to deliver more, virtual, maybe at some point humanistic experiences. And I think what I'm finding when we talk to both patients and providers is that, something like SeamlessMD, where it's clearly a digital patient engagement. It's clearly not trying to pretend to be someone talking to you. Patients know it's an application. But with chatbots, we try to make it seem more like conversation. And, my sense is that for other industries, let's say customer support, for example, chatbots don't seem that strange. We're okay with it. But my sense is that when it comes to the provider-patient relationship, it's not as clear that people are comfortable communicating with a chatbot about, let's call it, sensitive healthcare issues, right? So the idea that, would I be okay talking to a healthcare chatbot about cancer or mental health issues I'm having or things like that? Because I know companies are trying to tackle it, but I'm not necessarily sold that the lack of humanistic interaction is going to be successful with patients, unless you get to the point of a Star Trek world where you have a hologram AI that looks and feels like a human physician. Until we get there, I'm not quite convinced that patients will be able to engage successfully with virtual healthcare assistants that are more like chatbots. I'd love to get your take on that, and where you see that heading.
Do you think that the technology is still early?
Yeah, I'll be honest. So the chatbots that I've seen, they don't use natural language, processing, they pretty much use, it's almost like a survey looking like a chatbot. So it would say, hi, dear patient, what information about your colonoscopy are you looking for today? Do you want to learn about A, your bowel prep, B, when your procedure date is, C, complications, and you just pick answers? I mean, it's not really natural language, right, at this point?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd sort of look at this in a few different frames, maybe. So one is, the technology is great, but it's kind of like where dial-up modem used to be, right? It's like you had to plug in, you had to ring, and you had a certain amount of hours it could be on, and it was slow as hell, and just wasn't really seamless, right? So maybe that technology is there today and where it's going. It clearly doesn't replace the role of a physician and a human interaction, but can the chatbot equivalent of tomorrow be a mentor, be a coach, right? Something that we can't scale as physicians, right? That, like, where are physicians' skill sets, best deployed, right? So, or clinician skill sets. And for each individual person to have access to a clinician at all times of the day is not a scalable venture, right? Like, and it's probably not that interesting for the clinician, because clinicians are trying to solve new problems, this, that, the other, right? And take care of the super sick. So there's a real role for it, but, will technology get us to the point where there's empathy, where it's actually useful for the patient? Right now, it's this friction to using it, because most of the time it doesn't work really well. It's kind of annoying, and it's kind of like got a preset set of questions and not really the ones that I'm interested in as a patient. So I think there's role for improvement, but the idea of having a health coach or that's scalable, I think that would appeal to patients. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think there's certain workflows that patients will engage with, even though it is a chatbot. So I do think, most of the chatbots are more like symptom screeners right now, as I'm sure you've seen. So I think those are okay, because I think patients are receptive to, okay, it's asking me about, my temperature or my pain, and that as a chatbot, I think, is pretty reasonable. I think where it gets dicey is, having a conversation with the patient about, their mortality, and if they're palliative, or even, I think, mental health still, therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. I think those things, which tend to be more conversations, I think unless you get to a point where you have an AI that you can't distinguish between a human, I think a lot of those require face-to-face too sometimes, for the tougher conversations. But I think a lot of the simpler workflows or data collection or touch points, like you've mentioned, I think chatbot type experiences could be reasonable. And I think a lot of patients will engage with that successfully.
I wonder if it's iterative as well. Like, it all depends on what does the patient get out of it.
Yeah.
If the patient feels and is tangible that I got some benefit out of this interaction, that I'm looking forward to asking this chatbot something else next time. It's so convenient, it works, it's this, it helped me, it saved me from doing this, that, the other, then they will engage more. If the experience is frustrating, doesn't really answer the question, the problem is not solved, then that's, people aren't ready to interact with that. I have been impressed, actually. You brought up mental health. I'm impressed by the amount of software and technology being applied in mental health, sentiment analysis, a whole bunch of interesting ability to scale cognitive therapy, being able to assess people's moods and change treatments based on that. So I have been very impressed with the use of technology in mental health recently.
And obviously a big opportunity to make a difference. So many folks are dealing with mental health issues that the opportunity of impact is really big. And to your point, from a scale point of view, software can play a big role in that.
Jehangir, I have to ask, now that you're on the other side of the table and you're investing as opposed to working in surgery, but still in the healthcare space, what are some maybe valuable insights that you can share with providers who are maybe looking for that similar jump?
Sorry, say that again. What do you mean by providers? Like clinicians?
Clinicians, physicians, anybody who maybe just has a misconception as to what it means to work on the business side as opposed to work in the clinical world.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess business often has a negative connotation in medicine. We're academics. We want to focus on the patient and not talk about money. We want to do what's right for the patients, and we want to be. Physicians historically have been seats of knowledge, which is a very prestigious thing, and we want to focus on that, right? And that's why we do all the training, and then we subspecialize in something so we get huge amounts of deep knowledge. What I've learned is that business itself can be a science. There's lots of business principles that if we apply them in medicine, that we can actually improve efficiency, ROIs, etc. Alberta Health spends 20 billion on healthcare, and maybe that's 5 billion more than it spent 15 years ago. But what is the ROI on that extra 5 billion? Really? Like, I'm sure we're probably delivering better medicine, but how are we measuring that? How are we just deciding where to spend the dollars, right? So those kind of efficiency processes, business can add a lot to. The other thing is that the innovation is coming from business, right? Especially with the digital innovation, the ability to bring what we're doing in the rest of our world into medicine is coming from there. So,
right.
So I think
what about in terms?
Go ahead.
What about in terms of skills that you've seen transfer over? So now that you're investing primarily, were there any skills and or frameworks that have stayed consistent?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I would say, from it's an individualistic thing. So people have different mental models. For me, it's in the past it's been about compounding knowledge and compounding meaningful relationships. And so I think that those are skills that stay the same. I think the ability to make good decisions fast, to keep trying to improve your decision-making quality, those are important skill sets as a physician, and those stay out the same outside as well. What was the second part of your question? Was new skill sets?
Yeah, or frameworks that have stayed consistent, or new ones that you've developed since leaving the cardiac surgery world?
So those are the ones that stayed consistent. New ones, how would I answer that question? So, okay, so in 2019, I have three things I learned from 2019, all from three people I hadn't met before. So three things. So one was the reward for good work is more work. Right. So if you just continuously do good things and produce well, when the idea of being more work is not just more work, but it's actually more interesting work, more things that you want to get into, right? And then the second thing is around networking. So people say, well, your net worth is your network. But the other take on that is that it's actually your network that's willing to help you. So it's about meaningful relationships, and who can you pick up the call and somebody's willing to pick up the phone and talk to, and somebody's willing to help you, and whatever it is, whether it's a business deal, a personal issue, whatever it is, at the end of the day, who is willing to help you? If people are willing to help you, it's because they're getting something out of it, right? It's about that alignment incentives again, right? So I think that's a new thing that I learned in 2019. And the third thing is I learned was around the easy part of things is actually getting into something. The harder part is figuring out how you're going to exit. So I think most human beings are very happy to get into something. So we're really happy that we got into university, or that we got into med school, or that we got a job, or we got a position at this place, or something like that. The challenging part, in some essence, it's not easy getting to med school, but the real challenging part is trying to figure out how you want to exit. Right? What are the relationships you want to build along the way? What do you want to remember about this? And so that's, I think those are some of the new things, sort of mental models that I've learned about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the tough part with, exiting as well is, like you said, you formed an identity around that. So that's so integral to who you are up until that point. And then when you leave, it's kind of that unknown space. I'm curious, because obviously 2019 was a big year for you. During that time, was there a moment that you ever realized, like, yes, this was the best decision for me moving forward? Was there a specific moment that you remember?
I don't know if there's a moment. I think it's more of a question for me of, figuring out what your sensibilities are and what resonates with you. I was having a phone conversation with a friend who reminded me about like 25 years ago when he walked into the call room once. I was sitting there and looking at the stock pages, and he's like, what are you doing? Look at the stock pages. Like, we're sitting in the hospital, and it was downtime or whatever, and nobody's reading the stock pages back then. We don't have stock pages anymore, and today this is when we have physical newspapers. So I guess there was always my interest in markets and understanding how business works and the speed of money. So I think those things were consistent. And what I'm doing now, sort of merging finance and healthcare, is an exciting area. It's an area where I can have an impact and do something interesting. Yeah.
Excellent.
So Jehangir, I know that we're drawing on the hour here, but we started this new thing where we kind of want to learn a bit more about you through what we call our Fast Five or our lightning round. So just a couple like short questions, but really what first comes to mind when you hear it. Maybe Alan, do you want to take it away?
Sure, yeah. So Jehangir, I know you're big into podcasts, so we wanted to know what's your favorite podcast or podcast episode, even if you have one.
Yeah, so I like categorizing things, so maybe not the best for fast. But I would say, so favorite podcast on mental models would be Shane Parrish's Knowledge Network.
Yeah.
In medicine, I really like Peter Attia, The Drive.
Yeah.
Have you listened to that?
Yeah, I listen to that one almost every morning when I don't drive anymore, but I do listen to that one.
And then in finance, I've been enjoying Patrick O'Shaughnessy's Invest Like the Best recently.
Yeah.
And then in the VC and startup world, I think I like the Greatness with Mike Maples, and that's been good. And then overall, there's another, out of the blue, there's 3 books with Neil Pasricha, which is kind of an interesting perspective on that. Yeah.
Excellent.
And lots of podcasts to listen, but those are all secondary to the Seamless podcast.
That's right. Yeah. What about advice you would give yourself 5 years ago?
So I have a problem with that kind of question and thought process, because I'm always sort of so focused on evolution and compounding knowledge. So whatever I know now, I know because of the experiences I had. Right. So if I hadn't had those experiences, I wouldn't have that knowledge today. So it's kind of like a fake game. I could tell myself all kinds of things that I would do differently if I was 22 or 25 today. But the only reason I actually know those things is because I went through them. So yeah.
Very true. The last question that we have in that Fast Five, it's a COVID-19 related question. So we're wondering if you've picked up any new hobbies or activities since the pandemic.
And you can't say Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was doing a lot of Zoom anyway before that, but actually, even since you brought that up, one thing that's interesting with Zoom is I've started Zooming with my parents, and we never did that before. True. So my parents live out of town, and I've always been able to Zoom with them, but always just talk on the phone. But now we have like a once a week Zoom call. And it's really interesting to see them. They like it. I really like it. My mom doesn't. They're all social distancing and they're not going out, but she's like, all dressed up. She's got lipstick on. She's like, her hair's done and everything. And it's interesting to do that. So yeah, you brought up Zoom. Like, that's one of those things. Like, COVID has just removed the friction towards doing these things. Like, I would do Zoom for professional business calls and stuff, right? But it wasn't so much fun. So what else has changed? COVID has definitely changed life for all of us. And I think for us, one of the things I've learned is it's allowed us to figure out what's important to us, because our lives were so hectic before. And so we realized, like, what are the things that we missed from 6 months ago? And those are the things that matter to us. Those are the people that are meaningful. Those are the kind of activities that we really do want to engage with. In terms of new things, we live in Calgary, so we've had access to the mountains. We've been able to go for walks in the mountains. We go as a family once a week, just walking. My wife and I have some more time together where we can go for walks twice a week. I started jogging with my teenage daughters, and that never happened before.
That's nice, yeah.
Yeah. What
It's
about
bringing
you?
the family together.
What about you, Alan?
About the same, but more family time. My parents actually similar story. You know, we could have Zoomed all the time, but now we're using Zoom all of a sudden. A big thing that I haven't ever talked about this on the podcast, but I'm a big filmmaker. That's my background. And so actually through COVID-19, I'm finding out different ways that we can make movies without, you know, with the physical distance still intact. And so maybe we can do more of a virtual movie and figure out different elements there. So yeah, I'll probably talk about that at
I
another
hadn't thought
point.
of that disruptive innovation type of thing, because like I was actually thinking that COVID was an opportunity to catch up on a whole bunch of stuff, because there's all this great stuff to watch, but there's not enough time. And I said, well, right now there's no new TV series and movies being made because everything's on hold. So it's a good opportunity to catch up. But what you're telling me is there is stuff happening.
There's a few disruptors out there that are figuring it out. Yeah. And then the last activity that Josh and I are both doing is this podcast. That's kind of a new thing that was spurred on. And,
True story.
Yeah. All right.
We've been talking about it for years. So
exactly. Well, Jehangir, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. I'm looking at the time. We're obviously a little bit over, so we want to wrap it up. But did want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day and being on the show and sharing a ton of life experience with all of us and all of our viewers. Really do appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. And thanks so much for organizing this.
Thanks, Jehangir. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Be well.